Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Dandelion Dynasty, Book 4, Speaking Bones, Chapters 30 and 31, The Temple of Still and Flowing Waters, and Cloud Grinifins. In these chapters, we are able to catch up with somebody that I am ashamed to say I straight up forgot about. And then we have a really, really exciting turn of events with the Grinifins that ties in extremely unexpectedly for me with something that I had been talking a lot about recently. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you so much to Kyle for commissioning this episode and also for allowing me to move up this recording. I have been going to take today and next Tuesday off from recording, but I decided that, since I'm on the very last episode and last chapters of a book series and TV series, that taking the time off right now would just be kind of a poor choice. And I didn't have any specific plans booked, so I was like, let me just move everything up and take next week off instead. So I really appreciate it, Kyle. And also, it's just been so long since I got to talk about this book series. I listened to these chapters for the first time back when I think it's been about a month now since I last recorded. I listened to them right away and was very simultaneously, I was glad I had listened, but also frustrated with myself because I got psyched about where we went in the story, and then I couldn't do anything about it. And I was just like, come on. Miss T says, a bummer for you to take a week off. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, Miss T. I have this attachment here that I put up, and it's covering up right where the chat is, and I did not foresee this. I wonder if I can just move this for right now. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. I got this thing so that I can put my phone up and record. And it's very convenient because it doesn't block much of the screen, but it blocks the important part for right now. All right, let's start with the beginning, as I am so frequently unable or unwilling to do. We start off with Savo, and first we get some history about what was going on with the Big Island at the very beginning and how so much of the land was just I feel like ravaged is probably too strong a word, because that implies that it was a sort of that when I think of that, I think of somebody coming in for a sort of corporate angle rather than people who are just trying to live, and this is the result of settling, but not exactly colonization and capitalism. So it doesn't feel quite as egregious. It just seems this is what's going to happen when people begin to proliferate and also farm, which is something that, as much as we sort of revere farming for really understandable reasons, it can be a pretty destructive way to get food from the environment if it is not done correctly or in balance. And not everybody cares about that part of it. So yeah, this, let's see. The denuding of the Big Island accelerated. Forests turned into rice paddies, sorghum fields, apple orchards, pastures for sheep and cattle. The live oaks and white pines turned into swaying ships, rattling carts, sprawling palaces, and moon-gazing towers. Game migrated deep into the mountains, refugees from a gridded and tamed land, except for the ringwoods. Here, the rough terrain and unpredictable weather prevented dense settlement, and warlords and kings, in order to stave off more populous rival states, promoted hunting and raiding as national pursuits. the primeval forest survived, bearing silent witness to a chapter of the island's history forgotten in other parts. And basically, a lot of people who are just trying to like get away from other human beings for a variety of different reasons wind up taking to the woods here and finding a way to live apart from the rest of civilization as much as they can. And it says to reach the heart of Rima, one had to pass through successive layers of defenses, all designed to discourage the idly curious and the irresolute. And there are all kinds of like animals that are dangerous as well as the people, fierce woodsmen and hunters. Should anyone make it through the dense ringwoods, they would be greeted with the sight of the rolling foothills and rugged ridges that led up to the towering mountain ranges, the cruciform spine of the Big Island. In these hills, one found misfits, eccentrics, rebels, heretics, misunderstood geniuses who preferred the company of monkeys to men, and fortune's stepchildren who sought nothing except the right to be left alone. And it took me a little bit to really get what he meant by fortune's stepchildren. And I always forget that when people are talking about stepchildren, what they basically mean is like, you technically have to take ownership of them, but you don't want to, and they're not really blood and don't count. So I guess what this means is unlucky bastards. I just found that funny. Like, fortune's stepchildren is just such a tidy and yet sort of passive way to say that, and I really liked it. It kind of reminded me of something that like Jane Austen would have said. And Sumaji, the greatest bladesmith, moved his forge here to be close to the abundant high-quality charcoal and away from ambitious though unworthy sword twirlers. Zato Ruthie, the most renowned moralist scholar of modern times, came here in his youth to live in solitude in a hewn log hut in search of enlightenment. And there comes this moment here, you guys. He says this, in search of enlightenment through immersion in the simplicity of nature. To be clear, it was said that his mother hired maids to come to his hut to do the laundry and sweep the floor every week, and that his sisters visited him regularly to bring him air-shipped Muning tea and homemade honey cakes. Evidently, not all the conveniences of modern civilization were corrupting or vulgar, though it would take a mind as great as Zatharuthi's to sort through which was which. And that is a pointed reference to Walden. Those who aren't aware, as I was not up until a couple of years ago, no idea that this guy is out here talking about living off the land and being like, you know, just relying on one's self and communing with nature. And his mom was coming to his house and cleaning up and doing his laundry. And if that is not a perfect example of women's labor being simultaneously crucial and completely unacknowledged, I don't know what is. I mean, that is, I love the fact that he referenced that here. It just makes my heart proud. Like, Ken Liu is a feminist for sure. And I like the fact that every now and then you really see him punch a little bit. He's like, no, I'm gonna make a little trouble right here just because, you know, I know men ain't shit. I get it. I see it. And I appreciate you, man. Really do. So eventually you get past that and you wind up in these valleys and summits. Let's see. Like rare orchids found on distant isles whose outlandish forms reveal the limitless potential inherent in the basic floral form, the sects that populated these secret shrines professed beliefs that filled every niche and nook, thereby hinting at the vast range of conceivable faiths by wandering far from the beaten path. And we get to talk about like all of these different sects of belief and who they worship and what the rites include for each of them, things like that. And then we go to Savo. And he has just been wandering Dara. And the man is a disaster. I have to, be honest here and say that I was not prepared for how few options he had. I don't think that I had stopped to consider exactly what he would do if it weren't to just go home. And I know he can't go home. The whole thing going on isn't resolved. It's not safe for him. He is supposed to have died. I knew that wasn't really an option, but I just thought he would find some way, and it would just be he would go under a different name. He would be in disguise. He wouldn't necessarily go to his mother, but he would find a way to filter back into things undercover somehow. I didn't really expect for him to just wander around Dara like this. And when I stop and consider what he's really struggling with here is not knowing where his place is. So I guess me expecting him to simply go back to where he had come from is kind of telling, because the whole point with his character is that he's Liuku, according to the Dara people, but the Liuku would not claim him either. They would be really, especially with how fundamentalist they've grown, they wouldn't see him as one of them at this point. And yet I'm sitting here as a reader, well, you're Liuku, go back there. But he doesn't feel Liuku. He knows he doesn't really fit there anymore. So I'm just kind of assigning the original identity to him that I had read and understood to be, that's where he comes from, that's what he is, without really appreciating the complexities of that and how little he really seems to it's not even necessarily, he's asking the question, where do I belong? But in terms of attempting to find a place, he isn't doing that. It's he's having such a crisis of identity here that it has overwhelmed his ability to take action. And he's just wandering because he genuinely has no idea what to do next. And it's been a year. That's a long time to go and genuinely feel aimless, And a part of me really feels for him, because that's a bad place to be, to feel as if there is nowhere for you, that you belong, that people are going to understand who you are, understand your language necessarily. He can speak Dara, but it's not his native language. But does he want to be around people who speak his native language anymore? It's just a kind of isolation that I really sympathize with. I haven't experienced it exactly, but I do understand the concept as somebody who, and I talked about this on Twitter recently, that there was a book series that I covered for Spoil Me, which is so excellent. It's by Lee Bardugo. Ninth House and Hellbent are the first two books in the Galaxy Stern or Alex Stern series. And they're really, really good. But one of the things about it that I got taken off guard by, Alex's character, she's the main character, she is Latina, but that is not much of her identity. She doesn't really speak Spanish. She didn't grow up immersed in a culture with a big family that all spoke Spanish, eating food from a different culture. She really didn't have the kind of life experience that one would call growing up as a Latina woman in the United States. And a lot of people who read the book who are Latina really took issue with the fact that her identity in their eyes was erased. And that was the wording that was used. And I found myself almost offended by that, because I am a Latina woman who grew up in the United States, who doesn't speak Spanish, who didn't grow up immersed in Colombian culture, who if you were to like meet me, you'd probably be like, I can tell she's not fully white, but I don't know what else is going on there. I was reading the book and feeling very seen, because often when there is a character who is Latina being portrayed in fiction, there is a lot of like, I don't want to call it stereotypes, because that feels like it's assigning an intent that isn't necessarily there. But there are a lot of tropes that go along with portraying that kind of character. And they may be like the reality for a lot of people, but they have never applied to me. And yet also growing up white has never applied to me either. So when I watch a lot of things or read a lot of things, I don't really see my particular experience represented almost ever. And I found it very refreshing to have a Latina character who like isn't white, but also the fact that she's Latina doesn't really like, it hasn't changed a whole lot about her life. She is passing enough that it's not an obstacle for her in most ways. It's really a class thing that gets in her way the most. And in terms of language, like she didn't really make an effort to learn it and sort of regrets it, which is also my experience. And so when I saw it like being talked about as if the fact that she's Latina but didn't, I think the example I used when I talked about this on Twitter was like, unless you're portrayed as making arepas with your abuela, then you're not showing the Latina experience. I was like, fuck that. What does that mean? Like, I am the daughter of a Colombian immigrant and I exist, but I didn't go through the kinds of lived experiences that a lot of Latinas in this country have. And just because one person portrayed doesn't fit with theirs, they suddenly are like, well, she doesn't count, which is honestly how I've always felt. Like, I don't really count. And so in that respect, I just like, I can understand how frustrating it is, but I have still managed to like find a place. And because of the circumstances where I'm living now, it hasn't been, we're not in like I was about to say, we're not in a scenario where the two sides are against each other. We are, but it's not quite the same, obviously, as this like all out war and colonization that's happening. So anyway, Savo's situation and the fact that he is just like literally shambling along alone, consumed by everything that has happened and longing for Dandelion and like guilty, and just he is kind of stymied, This was really rough. And eventually he like stops because it starts snowing and he's freezing. And he needs to rest a little bit. He's trying to like drink snow and chew on some like hide on his coat to trick his body into thinking he's eating, so it'll give him a fucking break for a second. And as he is doing all of this, he starts to realize that he can't feel his legs or arms anymore, and that the snow doesn't feel quite as cold as it did. And rightfully is like, oh shit, that's a really bad sign. So he tries to get up and he can't get up. He can't make his body do what it's meant to do. And he is just like, he reaches a point where he's like, well, I guess this is it. If I can't get myself up, then I have to accept that this is where I die and this is how it ends. And I was not thinking that he was actually dead, but I was really upset at the thought that like, if he hadn't been found purely by accident, this would have been the end for him. And he is so kind and so brilliant a mind that for it to have been wasted would have been a real shame. And apparently the gods agree, because it seems to me pretty clear that he like warranted a personal messenger for somebody to come and get his ass. So he wakes up and he's warm and he's in a bed, and there is this like creature that has a very freaky face, like right in his vision, and he screams and tries to like scramble away from it, but there's a wall behind him, so he can't get too far. And he hears people coming. He falls unconscious again, and then he wakes up the next time, and there is an old man with him, and the old man is like, "Hey, you are very, very hungry. We've got some broth for you. We're going to get you better. You just need to let your body adjust, slow down a little bit." And Savo is like, wait, you're speaking Liuku. What the fuck is happening? And he says that he like went outside. He says, "I suddenly had the urge to go outside to gather snow for tea." And I really like that specifically because it suggests to me that this was not like going to have happened by coincidence. There was a god that was like, "Oh, you need to get him out here. He's not even going to see you if he doesn't go outside the gate. Make him want tea." I don't know. And he sees this rabbit, it's a particularly holy creature, the dove hair. And he follows it to him, and that he was almost frozen to death. And he says, "I'm the abbot Shattered Axe, and you're at the temple of still and flowing waters where we follow the path of Rufizo Mender." And he says, "I was once called Ku Koriten, Wolf Thane of the tribe of Singing Sand. I fled Ukyutaasa when I became a Tantu Leonaro." Now, I don't know if this is somebody that we have met before that I should remember. I don't, but Kyle, if you're listening to this and if you know, like, you know, the answer to that, if this is somebody significant, definitely let me know, because there's been so much time passed, not only since I last recorded, but just in the books themselves. You know, the length of time these have spanned is like, at this point, at least 80 years, right? So I feel like we could really have, well, maybe not quite 80 because Gia is still alive. I'm not sure, actually, now that I say that, maybe 50? But anyway, this guy is explaining to him about this god, Toriowana, described as the merciful or he of healing hands. He had been born to the All-Father and every mother in the time before time, but there was another story, much darker and more detailed, about his origins. And the way that he was born to Kiki Savo, who came across a trapped star. Like other stars, this one had tried to depart the mortal world by climbing into the sky. However, she had been snared by a jagged bit of crystal at the peak and could not free herself. So he climbs up there and saves her, and she, because women in stories who are grateful always have sex to show how grateful they are, that is what she does, and then she gives birth to their son. He had the strength of a bull, the sharp eyes of an eagle, the sensitive nose of a wolf, and the keen hearing of a tusked tiger. He was the greatest hunter and warrior of the scrublands, and he led his people to victory after victory over neighboring tribes. But one day during a battle, his foster father was grievously wounded, his right arm burned to a charcoal black stump by Garinafin breath. As the man lay groaning in Torioana's arms, the young hero challenged death to fight him for his foster father's life. He called on the aid of his heroic birth father, but death refused to meet his challenge, and Kiki Savo didn't answer his call. His foster father took one last breath and stopped moving. And he doesn't move for 7 days and 7 nights, and when he comes out of this sort of stupor of grief, he is a completely different person. And the conclusion that he comes to is essentially, we all are going to die anyway. And there is such a variety of ways for our lives to end, for our plans to go awry, for starvation or injury or any number of other troubles to befall us, that we have got ourselves set up for plenty of suffering already. And we're out here creating war and just adding to that suffering. And for what reason? Like, really? We've decided that it's worth this? It's bad enough. Why do we consider it like an honorable thing to end lives and inflict this sort of grief and loss on other people? And so he essentially becomes this like cult leader, and he tells everybody that like their whole mission should be to reduce suffering, and that when if they are struck by someone who wants to take something from them, that if they strike back, there will only be twice the suffering. And so, of course, because this is like, first of all, the exact opposite of what Liuku have like lived by forever, and how most of them like survive, they start to sort of outlaw talk of his beliefs, because it's like extremely dangerous to have a whole clan of people whose livelihood, or at least like the power that they are accustomed to along with their livelihood, if it depends on fighting, and you've got a bunch of people who have been radicalized to not fight anymore, you're basically setting your clan up to be slaughtered. So they're like, yeah, he is not welcome here. Nobody's going to talk about any of the shit he talks about. And we get some info about people following him. He forbade his followers from possessing weapons or hunting. His band begged for milk and jerky from camps and passing herders. And sometimes they dug up wild roots and ate the carcasses of animals that had died from natural causes. And as soon as it says that, I was like, wait, so you won't let your people kill, but if somebody else kills and you have no problem buying meat off of them, that doesn't feel like it's really sticking to any sort of ideology, except like, I don't want to get my hands dirty, but you can go ahead, which is I think, a really kind of gross way to live. And, and I say that as somebody fully aware that like, I have never slaughtered an animal. So I guess I live this way. I've never been put in the position where I could slaughter an animal and haven't, like, refused to do it. So who knows? I like to think that I would be able to do it, but I have a pretty soft heart, so maybe I couldn't. So eventually he comes across this wolf who is leading her cubs and is saying to him, because he like gets in her way when she's going after this mouflon to kill it and feed her babies. And he tries to stop her from killing it. And she's like, I don't get it. First of all, you're trying to reduce suffering, but you're still eating like the meat of animals that other people have killed. So that's extremely hypocritical. And secondly, you keep us from eating and we are going to die. And that is creating suffering. So what you're doing isn't actually helping anybody. You're just stopping like this immediate suffering of this one animal to inflict it on a whole pack of cubs, which is like really fucked up. So he offers himself up to eat, and they eat his arms and legs. And I really do like that. It's one arm first, and she's like, that's only enough for me. That's like not enough for my kids. And then eventually every other body part, because she keeps being like, yeah, that's still not going to do it. Kujufin, always gazing upon the world with her single unblinking eye, intervened. She filled the wolves' bellies with sunlight and star heat, and the pack, satiated, howled with pleasure and left. The blazing goddess made new legs and arms for Torioana with shrub branches, and fashioned new hands for him from the segmented roots of the kogan grass. The new limbs had none of the strength of the old, but from then on, whenever Torioana touched a wound, it stopped bleeding and healed over without scars. So, of course, this leads to a lot more people following him because this is like a straight up miracle. And eventually, he has a family, and he arrives at this spot where two warlords are about to go into pitched battle. And when he attempts to stop them, they each give their grievances about what the other has done. Really awful things. And are like, it's really easy for you to sit there and talk about letting things go when you're not the one that's like filled with rage because you experienced this horrible treatment. And what if you were really put to the test? And so then we get this awful sequence where Torioana is given a weapon and told that he can fight them at any point. And he has to watch his kids and his wife get tortured and killed. And he has to keep himself from attacking to help, because otherwise he's betraying his ideals. I'm going to go through the whole story before I comment on this. And then when they reach the end of this exchange and his wife has died, he gets up and he touches the men who were hurt by his family fighting back and heals their wounds. And one of them, they're both really startled by this. And one of them asks, "Why didn't you turn your face away?" To blind one's eyes and deafen one's ears against the suffering of the world is also error. To avert one's face, to hide behind the excuse of ignorance, is also a sin that increases suffering. As soon as he said this, his heart stopped beating and his lungs stopped pumping. The pain he had experienced was too much for his mortal body, even though he had limbs and hands of bark and grass, not flesh and blood. It was said that the waters of Aluro's basin then turned to blood, and the very heavens wept with a raging storm that lasted 7 days and 7 nights. And eventually, these two chiefs understand that this guy was being protected by the gods, basically. And that it says the All-Father and every mother had spared them only in honor of Torioana's wish to add no more to the suffering of the world. So they give him this big, lavish funeral to honor him. But before they can put his body up, a star descended to earth and took him into the heavens, where he became Torioana of the Still Hands, the Pacific, the god closest to human suffering. So this story, this is one of those things that I really, really struggle with, because I understand the theory behind what he is saying in terms of fighting back only increases the pain on both sides. And especially when it comes to vengeance, which is a sort of endless cycle, where is the fucking limit? Where do you draw the line and say, okay, now we're done. Both sides have been appeased. Nobody is ever satisfied unless they have the upper hand when it finally comes down to those sorts of real vendetta situations. So I get his thinking there, but the part that I don't really agree with, he's talking about how I'm not going to increase suffering, and so I'm not going to fight back against these men who are trying to hurt my family. But by not fighting back at all, in my opinion, he is increasing suffering, because their torture was drawn out specifically to get him to fight back. And if he had fought back, they would probably have been killed and their suffering ended a lot more quickly. And this is where it comes to a question about whether death is the same as suffering. And I think probably when you're dealing with grief and the suffering inflicted on people who have lost someone, yes. But also, if it's the suffering of this one man as opposed to the slow torture and death of his several family members, that still seems like he would be minimizing suffering by taking upon himself only and not forcing them to endure this thing because they are being used to try and trick him out of his ideals. And what it always comes down to for me is, would hurting a certain person keep a lot of other people from being hurt? And if the answer is yes, then I can't see it the same way as an act of violence in war to take someone out of the equation if what they are going to do is continue to perpetuate harm on people, especially because this is their culture and tradition, and they fully believe this is the way to glory. And does it cause suffering for you to kill this person? I imagine it would if they have family or people who look up to them or love them or rely on them. But ultimately, you are doing a net good by helping those who would have been their next victims. And so then you have the question of if it's okay to take somebody out of the equation who was going to do that kind of harm, are you willing to take on the burden of having inflicted that violence for the good of other people, even though it's a repellent or just upsetting thing to do? Because I'm not trying to say that just because somebody is a bad person who is going to hurt others makes it easy to kill them. But maybe the sacrifice that you should be making is your own peace of mind in exchange for the lives and the suffering of other people who would have been in their path eventually. And that's a question that I've thought about a lot lately, that we have this concept of a hero who is willing to, keep himself pure by not killing. But there are so many examples of those types of heroes who do things that are one step away from not killing, is killing. So they do something that's technically they haven't killed a person, but ultimately that probably will lead to their death, or it will put at one point it was referenced, rather than executing somebody, they would maim them and exile them, which is leading to their death almost guaranteed because they can't provide for themselves or protect themselves. But because you haven't personally killed them, you're flattering yourself that you are being so merciful when you're probably just drawing out their suffering. And so that was kind of where I kept falling here, is he is watching his family go through some of the most horrific pain imaginable, having body parts slowly cut off, and being, in my mind, really precious about his own hands staying clean in this respect. And I couldn't help but feel like it was missing the point a little bit. But that's the thing about stories where you've got these sorts of saint-like figures, is there are a lot of gray areas. And the point of these types of legends and myths isn't that they are a perfect explanation of a real ideal. It's that they represent something that's so extreme that they become the personification of the idea, rather than somebody who lives in the gray areas of the rest of humanity. So I understand that, and I get that he is the whole point of him is that he takes things to that extreme, and that is why he is essentially a saint. But I have just gotten to a point personally where absolute pacifism feels like it has been touted with this sort of elitist attitude for so long, as it has been pointed out earlier in this very book, that I don't view it with awe anymore. There's a part of it for me that feels almost selfish, you know? So anyway, we come back to the present, and Savo is talking with this monk, basically the abbot, who is talking to him about where he came from and the things that he did and finding this place and how it changed the way that he saw things and his understanding of like how like forgiveness works, and that he had been seeking a God that would forgive him, but that's not really what he got. And it's an interesting idea, the concept of like, I am going to tell you to avoid inflicting suffering, but I'm also like not going to fool you into thinking that you can get away with the things that you did because I have forgiven you and thus those things have been washed away. The effect of the harm that you inflicted still exists. And if anything, it'd be doing a disservice to the people who were affected by it to simply say that I waved my hand over your head in blessing and now those things never happened. Of course they happened. You did the thing and the consequences remain. Just because I said something to you doesn't completely absolve you, and it doesn't end those consequences in their tracks. And I really appreciated that. And he's talking about like his son dying, and that really what he wanted when it came down to it wasn't vengeance. It was for his son to not be dead, which he could not get. And so that sort of led him to, how do I reduce suffering in the world? And let's see, the monks and nuns nursed me back to health, and I learned that this temple is dedicated to Rufizo, the native god of healing and pastures. But their version of the deity is distinct from the patron of Fasa. As heretics, they are often persecuted by authorities in Thera. And when Savo asks why, he tells a story that I really don't have time to get into because I still have a whole other chapter to cover here and I only have 15 minutes left. But I'm trying to find the spot here where I can sort of like summarize this. Let's see. They discovered stories about Rufizo bringing peace to lifelong enemies locked in deadly combat, offering to jump into boiling pots in place of condemned criminals, melting away hatred by self-sacrifice. They argued that those who followed Rufizo needed not only to heal individuals, but mend and restore broken and sick body politic. Mapidere had to abdicate in order to remove the source of violence and infection. Zana soldiers had to put down their killing swords and slave-driving whips to give the world a chance to heal. As these voices of protest gained strength, the high priests of Rufizo in Boama grew alarmed. A grand council of senior priests and abbots was held, and after 7 days of debate, the doctrine of Rufizo Mender was declared heresy, and its followers would be expelled and driven from the temples. Yeah, that sounds like what would happen. Oh, a religion that's founded on the principle that our sovereign shouldn't be actually in charge and that everything that we have been doing in our entire civilization flies in the face of, like, morals. Nobody wants to hear that. And he says they accepted the decision and then they basically snuck out into the forest and decided that they were going to continue believing what they believed, but they weren't going to push the issue in the face of folks who were clearly like just worried about their authority being challenged. And they weren't going to make it into a political fight. They were going to do their best to live by the principles they believed were real in a more private way. So that makes sense to me. And he says, the masks around the temple remind the monks that suffering is everywhere, that the world is broken, and that we cannot avert our eyes. Which I thought was really interesting. Just, in a civilization that doesn't have social media to remind you of that shit constantly as it is. And let's see, if I, without being forgiven, how can I heal? What is punishment but another name for vengeance? What is forgiveness but an illusion? Let's see, one day, he stayed behind to dress my wounds. Something changed. When I was fully recovered and we were ready to part ways, I told him I would abandon my profession and devote the rest of my life to making restitution. And he asked, if they want to beat you, what do you do? Then I'll accept it. How do you know when you've made enough restitution? When they forgive you. Or when they forgive me. But how will their forgiveness wipe away what you've done? We didn't kill that chicken we ate for dinner with our own hands, but we benefited from its suffering. When you were a baby, you didn't go out to raid or rob, but you grew strong and hardy from the wealth obtained from your father's crimes. Will you seek forgiveness from the chicken? Will you ask to be punished by your father's victims? All of us are entangled in webs of suffering and pain, and there is no power in the universe that can mete out enough punishment or offer sufficient forgiveness to free us. And this is some real Good Place shit. For those who aren't aware, The Good Place, there's a lot of like memes and a lot of talk about it in pop culture, but it is genuinely a show that asks a lot of questions about this type of like, what does it mean to be better and do better? And how do you know you want to do better for the right reasons? And the whole idea of like, you're never ever going to be able to live in a way that truly doesn't harm anybody is a big part of that. So this just reminded me of that. Heal thyself and the world with thee. And Savo is left with these thoughts and brought back to his room to go to sleep. And that is the end of the chapter with him. So I'm really interested how this is going to affect him. Like, I don't necessarily see him becoming a really fundamentalist disciple of this idea, but I could see him like this idea lodging itself in his mind in a way that's like going to influence him a lot in his future. So we go to chapter 31, and even though this is a whole chapter, the previous one by audiobook was a full hour. This one was only about 30 minutes, and a lot of it is action. So I think I will be able to actually talk about most of this. There are two main things that happen here. First, we have got Tovo seeing all of the people who have come to a complete standstill on the battlefield below. And when the previous chapters covering this battle where they ended was with the sound of the tusked tiger being sent out with one of those like horn speakers, basically, so that everybody was brought to a complete halt. But because he's up in the air on his Gerinifin, the sound doesn't hit the same way. And so he doesn't understand what's happening. And he looks down and sees all of his forces on foot come to a standstill. And he thinks that this is a result of like a superstition on their part. And is like, all right, well, I and all of my other Gerinifin riders are going to take care of this because we're not fucking simpletons who believe that this Arutokoa, I think is what they're called, the creatures that are made out of like mechanical parts. He's like, we aren't afraid of these because we're not gullible backwood hicks. So I guess we're going to have to manage this. And he heads in to light all of them on fire. And we go into the cockpit of the like big center one where Thera is with Thorio. And Thorio is very much like the whole vibe that she is embodying throughout this chapter, but really for the past like half of this book, is really the attitude of, I'm trying to remember his name. I'm sorry, guys. I was just talking about him, but the whole Toriwana, that's it. She saw people die for the first time way back and immediately was like, what the fuck? Why do we do this to each other? And has sort of never recovered. And so in this chapter, it's just a lot of her panicking and being like, what's the good of us even winning this battle? Because it's not going to be the end. At one point, Thera tries to assure her that once the Agon are free, the killing will stop. And Thorio's like, will it though? And I'm like, yeah, I get why you're saying this, Thera. And as Thera says, this is no time to start like debating morality and philosophy. And she's not wrong. But Thorio isn't foolish enough to like believe that line, because we all know that's not how that shit works at all. So, she then thinks to herself, Thera does, where the hell is To'of? And we go to his POV, and he is just like using his Yahoo on his Garinafin over and over again, who keeps calling out for help. And what it turns out he is trying to do is summon other Garinafin who had been freed to come back and help them fight. And he isn't getting the response he was hoping for. And he starts to kind of be like, I'm a fucking loser. I can't believe I thought this was going to work. Everybody throughout my life has always been a little bit impatient with me because I'm so obsessed with Garinafins and was like more comfortable around them than I was around people. And now I'm starting to think maybe they were right to be annoyed with me, because I put all of my eggs in the Garinafins are going to save us basket, and that shit is turning into nothing. And he is really like, so the dejected sensation with him reading his section really got me so depressed. But then all of a sudden, this is so good. I'm trying to find the spot here. Though the rebel crews fought valiantly to save their burning fortresses, they were overcome one by one. The many-limbed wolf howled defiantly toward the sky as its thick limbs, weakened by the intensifying blaze, buckled and collapsed. Tovo cackled in delight. This fucking guy. He would be remembered as a greater warrior than even Tenryo and Kuju. And I'm just like, will you? So then the next moment he looks up and there's a shadow that's blotting out the sun. And there are 1,000 Garinafins congregating from every direction, their wings a dense cloud that turned day into night. For a moment, he wondered if the Dara witch did know real magic after all, and had conjured the cloud Garinafins as her allies. The truth was both far stranger and less so. And yeah, they use that call, and To'of is able to pull them. And you guys remember how I was like, I feel like everybody seems to be really overlooking the fact that the type of torture they're using to get the Garinafins to cooperate is advanced enough to indicate to me that the Garinafins are way more intelligent than they're being given credit for, which means they could really fuck your shit up eventually. And they have just like simultaneously been treating them as completely dumb animals that have no real understanding or, like self-awareness, and yet also are using a means of control that indicates the exact opposite. Which, as much as I want to be like, how could that be? we know how often that is indeed the way we approach things. Will be so much evidence pointing toward another conclusion. And yet, nobody will pay attention because it's not the conclusion they want to draw. So, at this moment, To'of, you guys, this is so... As columns of smoke over the battlefield swirled in the wing gusts of the new arrivals, he seemed to see the wispy form of a star-eyed cloud Garinnifin, piloted by the insubstantial figure of the woman who had been his dearest companion through the years. "Thank you, Radia," he muttered, his vision blurred. "Thank you, my friends." And I loved this so much, especially, like, it didn't really occur to me, but To'of and Radia were only friends. I don't think was ever anything romantic between them. And I really enjoy the fact that that was all it was, that they had a platonic relationship that was really strong friendship. And it didn't have to be anything else for me to, like, see them as a package deal, basically, you know? And I love the fact that To'of's faith in the Garinnifins is paid off here, and that they do indeed have his back in a way that he really expected them to. And just his faith being rewarded and his kindness to all of them being rewarded. But then we go to a pretty horrific moment. So Thorio, who has been like she climbed out of the cockpit in the midst of the fire. Tovo comes down on his Garinnifin, which crashes, and begins to try and climb up the beast that she is on to get to Thera, because he knows which one she is in. And at first, when he sees Thorio, he's like, oh, now I got to deal with this one. But he sees her shrink away. He sees how small she is. And he's just like, oh, okay, there's going to be no problem dealing with her. So he just like kicks her aside and continues climbing. And we're in Thorio's head for this. And she's just thinking about the preciousness of life, so that when he kicks her aside, but doesn't kill her, her initial instinct is just to be so grateful that she isn't dead. But then she starts to be like, but wait a second. If I just let myself live and like be happy with that, then Thera will die. And she starts to remember a conversation between the two of them where she was sort of trying to ask Thera, how do you ever know what's the right thing to do? How do I know who to be loyal to when I'm not blood with any of you? I wasn't born in Dara. Like, there is, I don't even really believe in the gods. What do I do? And Thera is like, your conscience is the only thing, and it knows. And the only thing that will like help you figure that out over time is experience. And Thorio says, the only thing I know is that I will never kill. It was killing more than dying that she feared. And then she's watching Tovo, and he pulls out the knife and starts to try and get into the cockpit. And she climbs after him. A sense of peace descended over her. She wondered if this is what Thera had felt when she had been under the power of the silent roar of the tusked tiger. She wondered if this was what people meant by the presence of divinity. She wondered if this was what Agilek felt as she contemplated ancestral spirit paintings, what Tipotho and Imjegon felt as they listened to stories of ancient heroes. This was the mortal condition, she realized. She would never know with certainty the right path. She would never experience enough to act with absolute conviction. She would never be able to eliminate all suffering. All she could do was act in the here and now, to live and die for love, to fight and battle for friendship, to trust in a conscience that was never perfect but capable of being perfected, to scintillate in the bright light of winter on the frozen beach suspended between the eternal ocean and the inconstant land for the brief instant allotted to us all. I really enjoy that, and that was highlighted by a lot of people in my Kindle. And he turns around Tovo and stabs her and slices across to spill her guts, very literally. And she holds her intestines in her hands. You guys, this is so metal. I swear to God, this is so, like, I can't. To be human meant to be entangled with other humans. So instead she threw herself forward, entangling Tovo's lone arm with the loops of her intestines. "I don't hate you," she croaked. "I will never kill." Tovo cursed and tried to kick her away, but Thorio embraced him, locking her arms and legs around his torso, and refusing to let go even as she felt the vitality seep out of her wound with her blood. Blood and gore dripped down the top of the skull cockpit through the eye sockets, falling onto the startled figure of Thera, which is just so rough, you guys. Like, can you imagine? Oh my God. And Thera, she's saved, and she climbs out and holds Thorio, and it takes her a full month to create a sort of memorial. Let's see. Instead of a tombstone, there would be a shell tablet etched with logograms, many-tongued, world-traversing, lamb-kind, tiger fierce, Gerinifin wise. It was the fate of all mortals to end in dust. After burying Thorio, Thera undertook a journey to the seashore. There, giant turtles were captured and a design etched into their living shells, a blooming lotus floating above a tranquil pond. How far will they go? What will they behold? What distant shores will they touch and visit before they sink and sprout and grow and bloom, to sway over sun-dappled waves anew? It would be her last message home to her mother, her brothers, sister, Zomi. She had succeeded. The Liuku threat was no more. She would also never see her family and lover again, and her memories of them would fade in time, just as their memories of her would fade, or had already faded with the passing years. Life always went on no matter how close death loomed. And this got to me because you guys know that I was a little bit startled. I thought that I understood what was going on when she had attacked Tenryo's son. I can't remember his name. That she was like taking over and going to cross back through herself, and was startled when it was simply to keep them from going through. She did not plan to go through. And so I had come to the point where I was like, oh my God, is she just not planning on going back at all? And it seems like I don't know if up until now she had been planning on going back through the next time that the Wall of Storms opened, but this, for me, seemed like she was finally really facing that was it. And I just don't want to believe it. I'm going to be honest. I want her to go home. I want her to go back to Dara. I want her to bring the humanity of the Liuku with her, her understanding of the Agon. Like, I want there to be a miracle. And that's just not how this shit really works. And especially not in these books. You know, there are so many moving parts and Ken Liu is very good at being like, somebody can be very good and have a lot of influence and talk sense, but you've still got a ton of individuals who are going to have their own thoughts on a thing. And so much damage has already been done. I guess it's not really possible the way I was imagining it. But as far as staying here, I just don't really see her being able to lead tribes that are used to the kinds of violence that the Scrublands are and holding that power. They respect a certain kind of brutality that I just don't know Thera to be capable of. She can be ruthless, but not brutal. And it feels like a lot of the folks here really only respect brutality. I'm worried about her. You know, so I don't know. I guess we'll see. But I have got to wrap up. I'm over time. So thank you so much again, Kyle, for commissioning this. Very glad to be back in the world. It'll be a little while until my next recording on this. I think, about a month again. August 31st is the next one. So it'll be a little bit. But I'm glad that I got a spot of break between to cover these really good chapters. Thanks for listening, everybody. Until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.